Court is back in session. Would the defense like to cross-examine the witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Hello, Detective. When you pulled up to 1799 Lamont Street at 10:38 p.m., is it true that an unidentified woman told you that they were always calling the police about fights between Mr. and Mrs. Monroe?
Yes.
Is it also true that the unidentified woman had said this time George had finally went and done it?
Yes.
Did Mrs. Monroe open the door to the house when you knocked on it?
Yes.
Did Mrs. Monroe clearly state that she had shot her husband and then pointed to the dresser across the room where you found the .32 caliber revolver that was recently fired?
Yes.
Looks like she had nothing to hide. While you were walking Mrs. Monroe down the stairs, did her two children come out of the room crying?
Yes.
Is it true that those two children then ran to Mrs. Monroe?
Yes.
When you asked Mrs. Monroe some questions about the children, she seemed pretty disoriented and didn't answer the questions, right?
Yes.
Is it true that she was gazing off in the distance?
Yes.
Did Mrs. Monroe respond, now that it was all over, she wouldn't have to worry about them anymore?
Yes.
When Mrs. Monroe's sibling, Alex Chavez, arrived to the house, is it true that Alex stated that he felt afraid that something had happened?
Yes.
Did Mrs. Monroe have any bruises on her face?
Yes.
When you went back to the station, is it true that after reviewing the 911 call, you found out it was Mrs. Monroe who had made the call?
Yes.
After that, it says that when you asked her some questions, after you asked her some questions, you wrote it up in a statement.
Can you please repeat the question?
After that, it says that you asked her some questions and wrote up a statement, correct?
Yes.
That's really interesting, especially since you stated that earlier. She seemed to be very disoriented and was gazing off in the distance while asking her about her children. Anyways, did you come across some police records that indicated there were several complaints that were filed by neighbors about the fighting and screaming that went on between Mr. and Mrs. Monroe?
Yes.
Is it true that you said you saw bruises on her?
Yes.
As quoted in your witness statement, did you say, "How am I supposed to tell one bruise from another"?
Yes.
Since you've been a detective for the past 6 years and a police officer for the last 17, telling bruises apart from one another would be something you should know, especially in this situation. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. The witness is excused.
Does the prosecution have any further witnesses it would like to call? Who would that be? Terry Stein, please come forward.
Okay, now the vote. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, E. Reed and Associates.
I do.
Okay, Counselor, you may proceed. Watch out for the court. Go ahead.
Hello, please state your name.
Terry Stein.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. Well, now I'm going to ask you some questions. Please answer them to the best of your ability.
Okay.
How long have you been the director of the Washington Women's Shelter?
A year.
And when did you get the call from Mrs. Monroe?
It was right around Christmas in December.
What did Mrs. Monroe say to you when you picked her up?
She said her husband has been abusing her for the past couple years since they've been married.
What did you do after you received the call?
I gave her a private location where we can meet safely.
Did Mrs. Monroe tell you anything when you went to pick her up?
She said her name was Cynthia, but now I know her name is Martha Monroe.
What happened after you picked her up?
I let her settle down at the facility.
How was she emotionally?
She seemed helpless, angry, and upset.
You say that she was upset. I know that your shelter only has a 3-day period for the women to stay. Did you arrange another place for Mrs. Monroe to go?
Yes, I did. It was clean.
Objection. That is a leading question.
Repeat the question.
Did you arrange another place for Mrs. Monroe to go?
Say the part before that.
You say that she was upset. I know that your shelter only has a 3-day period for women to stay.
Objection sustained. Please rephrase the question or move on to another one.
Did Mrs. Monroe go to the other shelter you provided for her?
No, she didn't.
And did Mrs. Monroe talk to her husband?
Yes, she did.
What happened after you had talked to Mrs. Monroe after she talked to her husband?
She seemed very certain that she was going back home.
While Mrs. Monroe was at the shelter, did you do anything for her? Meaning, did you provide her with tests?
Yes, I did.
Objection, that is another leading question.
Objection overruled. On the leading question.
Can you repeat?
While Mrs. Monroe was at the shelter, did you do anything for her? Meaning, did you provide her with tests?
Yes, I gave her some aptitude tests.
With her scores, could she have been independent and supported her children without her husband?
Yes.
In your opinion, do you think that Mrs. Monroe was actually helpless?
No.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Cross-examination by the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. What is your name?
Terry Stein.
You are the former director of the Washington Women's Shelter, correct?
Yes.
Is it true that the first phone call you had received from Miss Monroe around December 1985, she had admitted she was beaten by her husband ever since they were married, and she was afraid it was going to happen again when he got home that night?
Yes.
Is it true that there had been a time where you had seen Miss Monroe covered with bruises and what looked like a burn mark on her right hand? Do you say that these can be considered signs of severe abuse?
Yes.
Is it true that Miss Monroe admitted to being beaten by her husband for years?
Yes.
Is it true that you had said and believed that Miss Monroe seemed very much like other abused women you had worked with, terrified, lonely, insecure, with very low self-esteem?
Yes.
Is it true that your facility was having space problems at the time?
Yes.
When you met Miss Monroe, she had told you her name was Cynthia, correct?
Yes.
Do you say that this showed a possible fear of being in a safe environment and worried she couldn't trust you? Is it true that you had known Miss Monroe would not be eligible for aid to families with dependent children because she was still married to her husband?
Yes.
Is it fair to say that Miss Monroe was financially dependent on her husband?
Yes.
Is it true that you had received information from her that she had been in recent contact with George prior to her returning home?
Yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Witness is excused. Prosecution, any further witnesses?
Alex Chavez, please come forward.
Left hand on the book. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you, Voyager of the Cosmos?
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead.
What is your name? Alex Chavez. What is your relationship with Martha Monroe?
I am a brother.
Are you married?
No.
Do you have any children?
No.
What was your reaction when Martha called you?
I was a bit surprised. She hadn't called me in a long time.
What was your reaction when she stopped calling you?
I was shocked because we had always been very close. I thought she just didn't want to have anything to do with me anymore because she stopped, or my family, because she stopped calling them too.
Did you ever see George beat on her?
Whenever I saw George, he was as sweet as can be. I never saw him beat her or yell at her.
What did you tell her before you hung up?
I asked her if she wanted to come over to my place, if she wanted, because, yeah.
And how did she respond to that?
She told me she couldn't because George was asleep. She had something to take care of, and this was her only chance.
What did you think when she said that?
At the moment, I didn't think anything of it. I just thought she had to clean or something. But as I started to think about it, it started to sound peculiar.
When you got to the house and saw the police, what do you think had happened?
I knew she had killed her husband.
Did you feel it was necessary for her to kill George?
No, I don't think she should have killed him.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Defense, cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Travis, have you ever been married?
No, oh yeah.
Are you still married?
No,
Do you have any children?
no,
Is it fair to say that because your sister has been married and has children, and you're in neither of these situations, that it might be difficult for you to relate to her?
yeah,
In your witness statement, you said, "I was even willing to put up with those 2 kids of hers." Alex Chavez, do you remember saying this?
yes,
What a shame that you would have to deal with your own nephews and nieces. Mr. Chavez, you continue on in your witness statement saying, "She told me that her husband George had come home drunk again and screaming about everything." When you say again, this must mean that George has gotten drunk and screamed at your sister in the past?
yes,
I see. But after that conversation with your sister, things went a little differently, didn't it? Is it true that the next time you called, she was very distant and didn't want to talk?
yes,
So, Mr. Chavez, let me ask you this. Is it possible that Mrs. Monroe couldn't talk to you because George wasn't allowing her to?
yeah,
Did Martha ever tell you about George having a temper?
yes,
Martha also complained to you that George hit her?
yes,
And when Martha told you about the pain situation she was in, was it not towards the beginning of their marriage?
yes,
Yet you never really believed George would just hit your sister for no reason. So you asked your sister if she ever provoked George. Is it true that you asked Martha this?
yes.
And what did she answer?
You said no.
She said no. But let's look at the real reason why you asked her this. In your witness statement, you said, "I told her that a lot of husbands hit their wives every now and then." Mr. Chavez, you don't see any issue in a husband hitting their wife every now and then, do you?
No,
So is it true that you just brushed aside that your sister got hit by George because, well, you think that's the way it is between men and women?
yeah,
Did you ever notice bruises on your sister?
yeah,
And is it true that she said they were for beatings?
yes,
However, Mr. Chavez, although you believe there was nothing wrong with what George did to your sister, part of you was in fear because, well, did you or did you not say, if George was as crazy as she says, I didn't want to get in his way?
yes,
So instead, you watched as your sister fell under his abuse. And sadly, when you guys last talked, before George's decease, she said, "I have to fix things now while he's asleep. This is my chance." Leaving her to make a decision on her own, she felt so threatened that she had to take matters into her own hands. That would be all, Your Honor.
Thank you. You're excused.
Does prosecution have any further witnesses it would like to call? Is there a way that you would like to say that?
Prosecution, rest.
Thank you, Counselor. At this time, does the defense have any witnesses it would like to call?
Defense would like to call Frank Nova for standing.
Frank Nova, please come forward.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you, John E. Reed and Associates?
I do.
Speaking to the microphone, sir. Go ahead.
Sir, what is your full name and your job?
My name is Frank Nova, and I currently work at the Washington Hospital Center as the medical doctor in the emergency room.
How long did you work in the emergency room?
For the past 3.5 years,
How often did you see Ms. Monroe?
personally 6 times, and an additional 5 I've seen in the records.
What were all the reasons she came in to see you?
All were complaints of physical injuries.
What did she claim that happened?
She would always say that it was an accident.
How often do you see women that come in with bruises and say it was an accident?
I see it all the time.
How would you describe the pattern of this denial?
Can you please repeat?
How would you describe the pattern of this denial?
I see it very often. Her physical injuries were consistent with other women that I've seen that have been abused.
On June 12th, 5 days before the killing took place, how badly was Ms. Monroe hurt?
The way I see it, she was suffering from oxygen deprivation, which means that she was passed out, and that there were signs on her neck of being choked.
What did you say to Ms. Monroe about her condition?
I told her that she was very lucky to be alive.
That will be all, Your Honor.
Thank you. Prosecution cross-examination.
Mr. Noble, is it true that you've been working for Washington Hospital Center for 3.5 years?
Yes.
Do you know about battered women syndrome?
No.
Mr. Noble, am I correct that you are not an expert on battered women syndrome?
You're correct.
Is it true that you stated that there was no way to be sure that Mrs. Monroe's injuries came as a result of abuse?
Yes.
On June 12th, when Mrs. Monroe went to see you, didn't she agree to see a police officer?
Yes.
Did she speak to the police officer?
No.
Your Honor, she did speak to the police officer. It was stated in the witness statement of Frank Noble. What did the police officer say Mrs. Monroe said when she arrived?
She said that she didn't know why the officer was there.
Your Honor, the witness cannot repeat or state what he had signed as a witness statement.
Okay.
That would be all.
All right. You're dismissed. Thank you.
Sometimes there are technicalities. Any further witnesses for the defense?
Yes, Your Honor, I'd like to present Pat
Dr. Pat Bergen, please come forward.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you, John D. Reed and Associates?
I do.
Okay.
Hello, and what is your name? Pat Bergen. Where did you get your PhD in sociology? In Georgetown University. And what do you specialize in? In abused and battered women. And how long have you been doing this job exactly? Since the mid-70s, so I'd say about 10 years. What are some of the characteristics of battered women? Well, they don't understand why they're being abused. They can't improve the situation or leave it. They're separated from their friends and family. They think they don't need help when they know they do. They see no point in help because their husbands or boyfriends keep abusing them and they think there's no stop to it. You said in your witness statement that as time goes on, the abuse towards women get worse and worse, and it causes lots of emotional damage as well. Do you believe that the emotional damage can cause someone to harm someone in such a way because they are tired of the abuse? Yes. And has Mrs. Monroe experienced the characteristics of battered women syndrome? Yes, she has been. Her husband doesn't let her talk to anybody. She's been abused, and she's been offered help and she doesn't accept it. She has been, she sees that if she leaves that the abuse will be more severely. And can you explain what learned helplessness is exactly? It's basically when there's no way out of it. There's no end to it. There's nothing that you could do to improve it. There's no way of stopping. Are battered women usually unable to see the choices available for them because they're too scared? Yes, I believe so. Do you, as an expert of these kind of things, believe Mrs. Monroe had the condition of learned helplessness? Yes. In your statement, it says, statistics say that between 80 to 90% of women who are abused either leave their abusive relationships or make it. Do you believe if Martha Monroe didn't murder her husband in self-defense, she would have been 80 to 90% who would have made it? Yes. As an expert on battered women syndrome, what is your opinion based on observations of Mrs. Monroe? In my opinion, I feel that she had suffered battered women syndrome. She knew she couldn't leave the situation. She tried, and there's no way
for her to get help from anyone. We would